Throughout the Super Smash Bros. Series, the ledge has been a feature that has received overhauls in every single iteration. From generous amounts of ledge invincibility in Melee, to ledge snapping in Brawl, to ledge trumping in Smash 4 and Ultimate, the game developers have clearly put an emphasis on finding the sweet spot for healthy ledge mechanics. Despite these efforts, top competitors for each of these games have consistently found ways to abuse the ledge. Historically, the most basic example of ledge abuse has been a strategy called planking, which is prevalent in both Melee and Brawl. Planking, which involves refreshing ledge invincibility over and over again in a refusal to get off the ledge, can be used to stall the game's timer once a player has a lead. While not unbeatable, planking can be highly effective in certain situations, such as when a character is particularly strong at planking, or when the opponent's character is poor at dealing with planking. In 2011, the Brawl community decided that planking was degenerate enough that it compromised the game's health, and had no choice but to ban it. The ban came in the form of a ledge grab limit, which stated that each player was only allowed to grab the ledge a certain amount of times per game. While the enactment of a ledge grab limit did arbitrarily buff certain characters and nerf others, this was considered better than the alternative of a metagame where planking dominated. Around the same time, I had been making an attempt to convince the Melee community that planking was problematic in our game as well. Back then, I mained Captain Falcon, and I constantly found myself on the receiving end of planking at the hands of Mewtwo King's Sheik. While I never denied that the better player was coming out on top in these sets, something about planking felt disingenuous to me. On June 19, 2011, I made a Smashboards thread in which I raised my concerns with planking's effects on the Melee metagame, and suggested that we soft ban it with a ledge grab limit, just like the Brawl community. This ledge grab limit could be monitored through the cliffhanger statistic at the game's victory screen, which revealed how many times the ledge had been grabbed by each player. If either player exceeded the legal amount of ledge grabs and the game went to time, that player would automatically forfeit the round. In the end, my proposal was shot down almost unanimously, and my thread was eventually closed. While I blame this largely on my failure to properly articulate my thoughts, it was most likely impossible for me to convince the community to limit planking back then. There simply wasn't enough of a widespread concern for it. Fast forward 8 years, however, and there has been traction regarding the possibility of a ledge grab limit at several points in time. While a ledge grab limit has yet to be adopted by the Melee community, it is currently less radical of an idea than ever, especially in light of recent events. This video will attempt to capitalize on the attention this issue has been receiving lately, and present a case in favor of a ledge grab limit for Melee. At CEO 2019, which took place this past weekend, Game 3 of Grand Finals was drastically different from the rest. In Game 3, Hungrybox grabbed the ledge 91 times in 323 seconds against Wizrobe for an average of 1 ledge grab every 3.5 seconds. Compare this to Hungrybox's ledge grab rates in the other 4 games, and it's clear that he employed a unique strategy to win Game 3. CEO 2019 wasn't the only example of successful planking in recent memory. In Game 3 of their EVO 2015 set, Hungrybox grabbed the ledge 105 times against Mango for an average of 1 ledge grab every 3 seconds. Then, in Game 5 of their SGL 2017 set, Mewtwo King grabbed the ledge 101 times against Westfalls for an average of 1 ledge grab every 4.75 seconds. Just a moment ago, when I used the word unique to describe planking, you might have been wondering, why should we condemn a strategy for being unique? At a glance, this might seem like a fair assessment. After all, innovation is what makes us remember Melee's best plays, and is the reason sequences like Ice's movements against Armada at Beast 6 are only seen every so often. Why should we expect players to conform to conventional strategies rather than think outside of the box? The reason, unfortunately, is that unique can have a negative connotation attached to it within the context of gaming. This is because a unique strategy is no longer healthy for a game when it can also be described as degenerate. Degeneracy in this context refers to a technique or strategy that is void of the skills traditionally required to succeed at the game. In Melee, these skills are widely regarded as an interactive neutral game and a constantly evolving punish game. Many lesser aspects of Melee can also be considered traditional skills, but these will generally fall under one of these 2 categories. An example of a degenerate technique in Melee that is constantly under scrutiny is wobbling, which involves repeatedly pummeling the opponent with ice climbers until it's time to finish off their stock. Wobbling is considered degenerate because it allows an ice climbers player to completely bypass comboing and edgeguarding an opponent. Normally, these are crucial skills that can never be truly mastered, but wobbling is the exception in that it allows a player to achieve a perfect punish game in exchange for a low execution requirement. Wobbling is also unique in that it completely removes an opponent's defensive counterplay. Options such as DI, teching, and recovering are absent once you are trapped in a wobble. Despite its poor design, however, wobbling remains mostly legal at Melee tournaments. In my opinion, the inability to agree to ban wobbling stems from its relatively low placement on the list of abhorrent techniques. This is because wobbling, no matter how infuriating, is still only a Tier 3 violation on what I consider the criteria for banning a technique. A Tier 3 violation is degenerate, and its respective game likely would have been better off without it. However, Tier 3 violations are missing a key trait that prevent them from being higher on this list. Unlike wobbling, Tier 2 violations aren't degenerate, but they do threaten to over-centralize the metagame. The best example of a Tier 2 violation in Super Smash Bros. Is Meta Knight in Brawl, who was considered so powerful that playing him was practically required. While a small pool of characters did have the tools needed to contest Meta Knight, the character was still divisive enough that he led the Brawl community to a fork in the road. If unbanned, Meta Knight and only a few other characters would be viable, but if Meta Knight was banned, all of the characters that he invalidated would become viable. Ultimately, the Brawl community never came to a unanimous agreement on Meta Knight's legality, but his presence still went to show the effects an over-centralizing game mechanic can have. One thing to keep in mind is that aside from banned strategies such as planking, Meta Knight wasn't degenerate. In fact, many would argue that Meta Knight was the most fun and complex character in Brawl. This was most likely Meta Knight's saving grace in the discussions surrounding his legality. Finally, Tier 1 violations are the most dire category a strategy can fall under. A Tier 1 violation occurs when something is not only degenerate, but also over-centralizes the metagame. Tier 1 violations usually require the most immediate attention, as they tend to warp the intended nature of the game in favor of an unbeatable or heavily advantageous win condition. Melee has experienced several Tier 1 violations throughout its lifespan that the community has established rules to prevent. The earliest example of a Tier 1 violation in Melee is the existence of stages that allow for circle camping, which involves perpetually running away from your opponent once you've taken the lead. If these stages are permitted, Captain Falcon and Fox are by far and away the best characters in the game, simply due to their movement speed advantage. Circle camping proves that a strategy should never be exempt from being banned just because doing so would go against the true nature of the game. When an otherwise beautiful game is tainted by such an easily identifiable flaw, it is the community's responsibility to intervene. Yet another Tier 1 violation in Melee is stalling, which can be performed by 3 characters. By repeatedly side-Bing with Peach at the bottom of certain stages, repeatedly side-Bing off-stage with Jigglypuff, or wobbling someone indefinitely with Ice Climbers, a player can consistently win the game as soon as they've taken the lead. Peach and Jigglypuff stalls can be dealt with, but only by a few characters, while the Ice Climber's stall is always a guaranteed victory. Stalling is different from circle camping in that it requires actual characters to be limited, rather than stages which are meant to be customized. Still, stalling qualifies as a Tier 1 violation, and was banned for its obvious consequences on the game's health. This leads me to planking, which is also a Tier 1 violation. Planking, however, is not as degenerate or over-centralizing as the other 2 strategies in this category, which has contributed to it being especially difficult to pin down. Advocates for planking remaining legal will typically argue that planking still preserves some degree of interaction, whereas circle camping and stalling do not. Additionally, planking has never been as over-centralizing as, say, Meta Knight in Brawl, so one might cite a lack of evidence as a counterargument. I'd like to begin by addressing the second point, as I believe it is more easily shut down. While it is true that a strategy should have to be over-centralizing in order to be ban-worthy, it must be understood that outside factors can contribute to a strategy being uncommon. Therefore, if we can prove that planking should be over-centralizing to Melee's metagame, it would be synonymous with planking actually being over-centralizing. One of the reasons I believe many players are oblivious to the effectiveness of planking is the fact that planking is almost never used in friendlies. This is the case because the Melee community at large glamorizes fast and aggressive gameplay. Styles that deviate from this ideal are often frowned upon, with planking being no exception. In addition, the degree to which a play-to-win mentality is required to plank is foreign to most players, and almost universally absent when the game is being played in a casual setting. Even when planking's impact on top-level melee is analyzed, it is clear that some sort of societal pressure inhibits players from abusing it to the fullest degree. Historically, only two professionals, Mewtwo and Hungrybox, have ever even attempted to plank their opponent, and both of them have only ever done so in moderation. In the 3 tournament sets I mentioned earlier, Mewtwo and Hungrybox both chose to plank when their backs were to the wall against formidable opponents. This is to say that Mewtwo and Hungrybox will never resort to planking in sets they are far less likely to lose. One of the best examples of a player succumbing to the stigma surrounding planking is Game 1 of Mewtwo vs Armada at EVO 2013. On several occasions, Mewtwo planks as Sheik for an extended period of time, and Armada fails to show meaningful counterplay even once. Surely, a player of Mewtwo caliber could have realized that planking for the remainder of the match was the logical win condition, so why didn't he? The answer, as silly as it sounds, is peer pressure. EVO 2013 was a monumentally important event for the Melee community, as it posed to usher in a golden age filled with publicity and sponsorships. Several key figures such as Scar and Prague had campaigned for Melee to be given a spot at EVO in the first place, which included raising over $94,000 for breast cancer research. For these reasons, there was an expectation for all of EVO's top 8 contestants to showcase the most vibrant Melee they had to offer, even if it meant reducing their chances of winning. Needless to say, there is overwhelming reason to believe that social dynamics have influenced players not to plank before, and so we should disregard a lack of over-centralization as a counterargument. Instead, we should look to prove that, in a theoretical world, planking is degenerate and over-centralizing enough to warrant a ban. Planking being degenerate and planking being theoretically over-centralizing are 2 separate subjects, so I'll begin with the former. Planking is degenerate for several reasons, but the main reason is that planking shows a desire to completely forego playing a neutral game in favor of an oversimplified, repetitive minigame. Earlier I touched on a technique that allows a player to bypass Melee's punish game entirely, wobbling. What I didn't explain at the time, however, is that while bypassing Melee's punish game is degenerate, bypassing Melee's neutral game is significantly more degenerate. This is to say that if degeneracy could be quantified, planking would be of far greater value than wobbling. This is because, from an objective standpoint, the neutral game is a prerequisite to the punish game in all cases. Because it is impossible to perform a punish without first engaging in neutral, the latter is naturally of higher value. Even if we were to completely ignore the order in which these phases of the game occur, the neutral game would still be of higher value due to its greater level of complexity. Whereas the punish game can technically be solved by a computer program designed to perfect the game, the neutral game will always contain a psychological component that allows for human expression. Therefore, bypassing the neutral game can be considered the highest possible offense. Another reason planking is degenerate is that planking is a timer scam. A timer scam is defined as a non-interactive win condition that can only be used when a player has the lead. Nearly every competitive game or sport has some sort of timer imposed on it in order to force interaction between the players. It is then common for several lesser rules to be imposed in order to prevent timer scamming. In Melee, this exact course of action can be seen through the addition of an 8-minute timer followed by a ban on circle camping and stalling. Another example of this course of action being taken exists in basketball, which contains a 12-minute timer followed by a 24-second shot clock. In the pre-shot clock era of basketball, it was common for teams that had a lead over their opponents to hold onto the ball for the rest of the quarter instead of attempting to score any further. The shot clock served as a necessary response to this strategy. At this point, you might be wondering, how are circle camping and holding onto the ball for 12 minutes any different from strategies such as camping the top platform and waiting until the very end of the shot clock? At first glance, it would appear that limiting certain timer exploits simply opens the door for others. However, there is a key difference between these strategies. While circle camping bypasses traditional skills in Melee such as the neutral game and punish game, top platform camping does not. Similarly, while holding onto the ball for 12 minutes bypasses skills such as dribbling, passing, and shooting the ball, waiting until the very end of the shot clock does not. The takeaway here is that using the timer as a win condition can never be fully eliminated. However, there are clear ways to identify strategies that do so in a degenerate manner. Like circle camping and holding onto the ball for 12 minutes, planking should never be compared to defensive strategies that still incorporate Melee's traditional skills. The third and final reason planking is degenerate is that planking takes advantage of what I consider a major flaw in Melee's game design. But before we discuss this flaw in detail, let's talk about one of the most critical skills to have in any fighting game: maintaining stage control. Melee, for the most part, is no exception. By establishing stage control, a melee player gains more room to work with, making them more likely to win the neutral game. Then, because the vast majority of attacks in this game send their opponent outward and off stage, neutral game wins against cornered opponents are usually more punishing. If Melee or any other fighting game didn't behave this way, the game would be inherently flawed. This is because encouraging players to jockey for stage control promotes interaction, while encouraging players to avoid each other promotes non-interaction. Unfortunately, while Melee does abide by the laws of stage control for the most part, there exists a mechanic that defies these laws: the ledge. Due to the 37 frames of invincibility a character is granted upon grabbing the ledge, most of Melee's high-tier characters are able to radiate an aura of safety from this position. This even includes characters who aren't infamous for planking. Fox, for example, is able to manipulate the ledge in order to land on stage with as many as 16 actionable invincible frames. During these 16 frames, Fox is able to approach the opponent with options that normally wouldn't be safe, such as neutral air. Options like these are uncontestable if executed properly and will easily lead to Fox regaining a considerable amount of stage control. For Fox and many others, the ledge is widely regarded as a stronger position than being cornered and on stage. This represents a fundamental flaw in Melee, as certain characters are granted an excessive amount of counterplay as a reward for forfeiting stage control. It is therefore important to realize that by enforcing a ledge grab limit, we nerf not only planking, but also any degenerate strategy that relies on Melee's non-interactive ledge mechanics. Before we can move on to the second half of our discussion, which will cover why planking is a theoretically over-centralizing strategy, we must clearly define over-centralization. Over-centralization in this context is defined as the excessive concentration of a technique or strategy within a metagame. To be clear, powerful techniques and strategies should be expected to over-centralize the metagame, while weak techniques and strategies will probably have little impact. Why then was it so important for us to establish that planking is degenerate before beginning this discussion? The reason is that a degenerate mechanic does not have to be as over-centralizing as a non-degenerate mechanic in order to be ban-worthy. Because non-degenerate mechanics can only harm a game by making its metagame stale, we are far more eager to ban mechanics that can harm a game in other ways. In other words, bans are issued in response to the totality of how degenerate and over-centralizing something is, rather than just one or the other. This concept exposes the flaw in the argument that planking should remain legal because, unlike circle camping and stalling, planking isn't completely and utterly unbeatable. If we were to value game health, a more appropriate argument would be, because planking is extremely degenerate, it should only remain legal if it is ineffective compared to strategies that incorporate Melee's traditional skills. This is to say that if, at the highest level of competition, planking is a viable alternative to playing the neutral game, planking should be banned. To understand why planking works, we must examine the root of the issue with the ledge. Upon grabbing the ledge, a character gains 37 frames during which they are completely invincible. The first 7 of these frames are called Cliff Catch, while frames 8 and on are called Cliff Wait 1. Despite not having its own title, frame 9 is notable for being the first frame a character is allowed to fall from the ledge. Upon falling from the ledge, a debuff that states that the ledge cannot be grabbed again for 29 frames is applied to your character. For example, if your character fell from the ledge on frame 11, they would not be able to grab the ledge again until frame 40. This would cause your character to be vulnerable on frames 38 and 39. Because of the 29 frame debuff, the only way to perpetually remain invincible by grabbing the ledge is to fall on exactly frame 9. This is true for all but a few special cases in the game. By falling on frame 9, the ledge can be re-grabbed on frame 38, causing there to be no downtime in ledge invincibility. In a world where players have perfect execution, there's no denying that the ledge is a problem. Of the 11 characters currently considered high or mid-tier in Melee, all 11 of them are capable of performing a completely invincible ledge stall. Of these 11 characters, only 2 stand out as being definitively worse than the rest. Peach, who must expend her float in order to plank, can only perform 1 repetition. Similarly, the ice climbers who cannot grab the ledge with both characters at once are guaranteed to put Nana in jeopardy by attempting to plank with Popo. The remaining 9 characters, however, are equally effective at planking in a perfect world. A perfect world isn't our concern, however, as human error is an unavoidable part of the game. Because falling from the ledge on frame 9 every single time is unrealistic, we are only concerned with whose planking manages to be effective even when a ledge fall isn't performed perfectly. Throughout my career, I have witnessed 4 characters plank with a high degree of effectiveness: Sheik, Marth, Yoshi, and Jigglypuff. In the interest of time, however, there is little reason to talk about any character other than Jigglypuff. Jigglypuff is easily the most oppressive planker in the game because, unlike the rest of these characters, she has 5 mid-air jumps. This means that traditional responses to planking, such as wave dashing to the ledge, are far less effective against Jigglypuff, since she can continue to hover in mid-air when this happens. Jigglypuff can then threaten to forward air her opponent should they refuse to give her the ledge back, which can lead to gimps at low percents. There are ways to defeat Jigglypuff's planking, however, what you will soon learn is the degree to which planking is truly degenerate. Whereas on-stage interactions are infinitely complex, planking's power is almost completely determined at the character select screen. Of the 11 characters I mentioned earlier, Marth and Sheik are the best at invalidating Jigglypuff's planking due to their ability to quickly and safely hit below the stage. Marth's down tilt and forward air can contest Jigglypuff without incurring much risk, while Sheik's needles travel too fast for Jigglypuff to avoid. Another character who's great against this strategy is Jigglypuff herself, as having 5 mid-air jumps means getting gimped isn't a concern. 2 characters who are only moderately effective against Jigglypuff's planking are Fox and Falco. Fox and Falco stand out because their laser can hit Jigglypuff if she makes the mistake of ascending above the stage. By no means does this completely shut down planking, however, it is still worth noting. As for the other 6 characters, they are severely lacking in their ability to contest Jigglypuff's planking. Projectiles such as Pikachu's Neutral Bee are simply too slow, while characters like Captain Falcon have to risk their entire stock just to get a small punish on Jigglypuff. Against these characters, the risk-reward of this strategy is clearly skewed to the point that any Jigglypuff player should have it in their back pocket. This leads us to the crossroads where we must make an educated decision on what is best for the game's health. On one hand, we can simply tell people to pick Marth, Sheik, or Jigglypuff if they want to ensure themselves an interactive experience. On the other hand, we can choose to ban a technique that uproots the very nature of how Melee is meant to be played. I hope this video has convinced the Melee community that planking is an abomination unlike anything else currently in our rule set, and that it is time for us to take action. The last subject that needs to be covered is how exactly should a ledge grab limit be enforced. The first point of contention is the number of ledge grabs each player should be permitted. In my opinion, we should clearly choose between the numbers 40, 60, and 80. Multiples of 10 are easy to remember, and being divisible by 4 means someone can cleanly say that a player has 10, 15, or 20 ledge grabs per stock. I personally recommend 60 ledge grabs, as this seems like a fair threshold based on the data. Next, it is a must that the ledge grab limit only comes into play if the game goes to time. This rule helps ensure that players are only penalized for using ledge invincibility to stall the match. And finally, the main point of contention is whether or not the ledge grab limit should only apply to Jigglypuff. I believe the answer is no for several reasons. For one, by banning Jigglypuff's planking, we are recognizing the on-stage neutral game as an invaluable skill. Therefore, it does not make sense to permit planking of any kind. By enforcing a ledge grab limit on all characters, we ensure that all character versus character combinations are interactive and no longer have to worry about matchups where planking is potentially over-centralizing. Secondly, we must not forget the concept of stage control I mentioned earlier. Under a ledge grab limit, characters lose not only the ability to plank, but the ability to counterattack from the ledge in any capacity. Against Jigglypuff, for example, a player can now choose to stand outside of the range of ledge hop forward air, since Jigglypuff is required to get up from the ledge eventually. As to avoid arbitrarily nerfing Jigglypuff any further, it is only fair that we apply this rule to every character.